Hey fam. So, I just finished Metroid Prime 4, and there's a lot I want to talk about, but honestly, something I found more interesting than the game itself was the overall fan response to it, because this has been a bumpy ride. If you're both familiar with the channel and into Metroid, there's a better than not chance that you've already seen my Other M hot take video, and although this one will not be nearly as inflammatory in tone, it will be something of a follow-up to it in certain respects. You don't necessarily have to watch that video first in order to appreciate this one, but it may give you more context into my personal mindset and philosophies when it comes to Metroid if you do so. So I'll link it in the description and at the end of the video as well. Anyway, as I just stated, what I really found so interesting about Beyond was the general fan reception to it, both in the lead up to its release and following its release now that it's finally in our hands. While I personally enjoyed it very, very much overall, I acknowledge that it has many faults, and I can understand a considerable portion of the fan ire. It's unfortunate that Prime 4 didn't end up panning out into the critically triumphant grand return that Dread was for 2D Metroid, but as is frequently the case with these more nakedly linear Metroid titles, I definitely feel as though the most extreme negative reactions are severely overblown, and I do think there is a certain type of Metroid fan that will still get a lot out of it, speaking as one of those fans. To start with, though, let me lay out many of the critiques, so I can talk about why they really just don't bother me all that much. This is a pretty different situation from the Other M fan reaction fiasco in some areas, but it's also strikingly similar in others. As soon as the Viola bike was revealed, a certain subset of Metroid fans began overreacting to high hell online, and that fire was only further kindled by the reveal of the now infamous Miles McKenzie. Once upon a time, this severe overreaction would have shocked me, but in the aftermath of my Other M video, it became clear to me that the Metroid franchise lives and dies under the gaze of a particularly strict form of fan scrutiny. Going forward, I'm going to refer to the individuals who harbor these especially restrictive views of what Metroid is and should always be as Metroid Purists, and I will refer to those who share my own mindset as flexible fans. I'm not here today to discredit Metroid purists because I can actually understand where they're coming from, and I'll go into that with a comparison of my own shortly, but I do want to articulate why a flexible fan like myself is able to enjoy a product like Beyond, even despite its lack of adherence to the absolute letter of the law laid down by the structure of the franchise's earlier entries. In order to do this, however, I need to refer back to a few of the points I made in the aforementioned Other M video. So, it seems to me that to Metroid purists, a Metroid game must contain all of the following: pure, unsegregated Metroidvania-style map design, item and exploration-based progression, and an atmospheric sense of isolation. Notice how I didn't even list Samus, and we're gonna come back to that. Now, going by the above list of, shall we say, asset demands, it's easy to identify why every previous series Black Sheep attained their Black Sheep statuses. Metroid Prime 3 and Other M in particular come to mind as far as mainline or mainline-adjacent entries are concerned. Other M was originally lambasted for, among other things, its rigid linearity and strong presence of other characters and dialogue, which were cited to interfere with the game's atmosphere and isolation. Prime 3, while at least better received overall than Other M, was also criticized for its overly simplified map design and isolated zones that the player is forced to travel between by ship, rather than having them interconnected for transit by foot, as in all traditional Metroidvanias and previous Metroid games. It's worth noting that Metroid Fusion also received backlash early into its life cycle, but for various extenuating reasons which are outside the scope of this video, the fan opinion on that entry seems to have softened considerably over time. What I find so interesting about all of this, however, is the fact that to Metroid purists, all of these elements, without exception, must be present. It is an all-or-nothing game, and for many of these individuals, having even one of these elements absent will result in a functional score of 0, or not Metroid, or bad Metroid, as it were. And the reason I find this so interesting is something I brought up in my discussion of Other M. I've been a gigantic fan of Metroid for almost as long as I've been playing video games, and I have never felt this way about the series. In fact, frankly, half of these elements aren't even a genuine priority to me. Sense of isolation in particular has always been borderline irrelevant to me. I don't dislike it, I'm just completely neutral on it, and it absolutely is not a package deal with atmosphere to me. And it's a profoundly weird feeling being in such an absolute minority on this, always hearing about sense of isolation as this priority alpha gold standard the series is supposed to be striving for constantly, and truly just not giving a shit about it at all myself. I also see a lot of people online talk about Metroid like it's a horror series, and to that I say, what are you people talking about? While it's true that Metroid has long harbored some trace elements of horror, and I know that it took a lot of inspiration from Ridley Scott's Alien, I feel that it frankly began its life as more of a swashbuckling adventure. People like to cite Super Metroid and its atmosphere as the series' progenitor, but if you want to get real technical, I say we look at the original Metroid and its remake, Zero Mission. Those games were never moody like Super Metroid. Have you heard their soundtracks? And the sheer level of power that Samus accumulates throughout each and every title completely precludes the series from being fairly labeled as any sort of horror, as far as I'm concerned. Especially in 2D Metroid, are you kidding me? Samus is a fucking effortless killing machine by the ends of those games, and she's arguably already considerably overpowered by the mid-game, with only bosses offering any real sort of combat challenge by that point. Anyway, my point with all of this is that if you want to stubbornly insist on what Metroid needs to always be, with absolutely no variation whatsoever based on the precedent of its origins, then check yourself before you wreck yourself, because Super Metroid wasn't the original title to begin with, and a lot of what you love about it so much was arguably new to the series when it came out. But to circle back to my original talking point, as I said in my other M video, Samus has always been the single most important factor in a Metroid title for me personally. And I think this may be the case for a number of other flexible fans as well. Now, I've seen a number of Metroid purists call this viewpoint out as being laughable or childish, and I think I see why. I believe they hear this standpoint and think that I'm saying that I just like the character herself from like an aesthetic and merchandisey viewpoint. Like, I just want to ask mommy and daddy to buy me that lunchbox with Samus printed on it. But that's not what I'm trying to communicate here. What I'm trying to communicate is that to me, playing as Samus is the vibe that I come to Metroid for. The same way that purists come for the sprawling interconnected map and the sense of isolation, playing as Samus just sort of is my top priority. That's why I'm here. And I'm not gonna apologize for that. She's cool as shit. Her design and loadout kick ass. Samus's kit as a video game protagonist is fucking iconic. It's the one thing I still can't get anywhere else. It's the reason that Metroid is so important to me. And as I said I would touch on earlier, I'm now going to posit this question. I'm genuinely curious why the Metroid purists never even bothered to bring her up. Is it because her presence can be assumed as a matter of course most of the time? Or is it because she is genuinely your last priority? And if she is your last priority, then I'll also ask this follow-up. Why do you even care if Metroid as a series lives or dies? To say that the indie scene has been pumping out quality-ass Metroidvania titles by the dozen, year after year for the better part of the last decade would be an understatement. We as a community are not lacking for Metroidvania-style games. Pure and traditional Metroidvanias, experimental Metroidvanias, Dark Souls-coded hybrid Metroidvanias, Metroidvanias with weird-ass gimmicks. We're drowning in Metroidvanias. So if Samus and her iconic abilities being my top priority is childish to you, then why are you even still here? Who gives a shit who's on screen if the only thing you care about are a sense of isolation and the goddamn map layout? Go play literally any other one of the hundreds upon hundreds of these fucking games that are out there, and for way more affordable prices, no less. For those of you for whom it's a bit more nuanced than that, however, I do believe I can relate when looking at a completely different series. Paper Mario, in its original formula and format, was infamously murdered and replaced by a homunculus wearing its skin as a bodysuit very early into its lifetime. Most early Paper Mario fans, myself included, are really only true fans of its original 2 entries. That's not to say that none of us have been keeping up with or giving later entries a chance to show off what they have to offer, but what Paper Mario is has fundamentally changed over time. It is no longer a robust adventure full of creative characters, party members, and locales, which meaningfully builds out the Mario universe in the form of a deceptively deep RPG. It has instead become a casual, mostly solitary romp of varying mechanics and quality, which mostly gets trotted around periodically because the Nintendo overlords enjoy its paper aesthetic, which was famously, and this is true, never the point. And I can see the parallels here, right? Here's a franchise that I used to love with all my heart, and now see as little more than a shadow of its former self, limping along aimlessly with no clear direction or sense of purpose anymore. This is a case where, despite the fact that Mario and his universe are appealing to me, and are part of what I loved about Paper Mario Once Upon a Time, the quality of the narrative and the depth of the RPG mechanics were just as important to me, if not more so. Mario isn't enough to carry the franchise on his own for me in this situation. Now, the reason I don't feel the same way about Metroid is because Samus has a lot more going on than Mario does, but also because I don't feel like Metroid's core mechanics and soul were ever ripped out and replaced with something entirely different. And this brings me to yet another point that I want to reiterate from my video on Other M. In that video, I discussed this idea of the Metroid franchise's macro and micro elements. To re-explain what I mean by that, when I say macro elements, I'm referring to the aspects of Metroid's game design which are holistic, or matters of the design document's skeletal structure. And when I say micro elements, I'm referring to the aspects of the game which are more tangibly felt in the moment-to-moment gameplay. When it comes to Metroid, I think of things such as the map design and flow of the game's progression as its macro elements, whereas the moment-to-moment room exploration and combat are its micro elements. And I've just always been more passionate about the micro elements of Metroid than the macro ones. I like Other M as much as I do because Samus still feels like herself to play as, especially when compared with Prime's gimped movement. And I'm fine with all of the more nakedly linear Metroid titles because you still explore. It's just that exploration is more localized to the rooms themselves as you search for power-ups and solve progression puzzles. The fact is, for all its faults and weaknesses, Metroid Prime 4 is still very much like its more linear brethren before it in these areas. It's true that the map design isn't as intricate and sophisticated as in some of the earlier titles, but the things you actually do from moment to moment and room to room still feel exactly like classic Metroid to me, barring a few exceptions. We'll get to that. If the macro elements of the game design are as important to you as the micro ones, then I get that, and that is your prerogative. But all I need in order to have a good time in a Metroid game is to play as Samus and, do Samus things. At the end of the day, the progression of all Metroid games can essentially be boiled down to a chain of power-up acquisitions that lead into each other until you're allowed to access the finale. At a subatomic level, you acquire progression items and use them to interact with the game world and enemies. The details change a little from entry to entry, but this concept has always remained consistent. You do it in Prime 3, you do it in Other M, and you do it in Prime 4. And as a result, there isn't a soul alive who can convince me that these games do not feel like Metroid games. The only thing these more accessible titles are fundamentally altering, as far as I'm concerned, is they're cutting out the middleman of a significant portion of the backtracking by isolating the zones and not forcing you to remember, or in some cases guess, the one place in the entire game world you're supposed to go after acquiring a new item or ability. Now, that's obviously a negative for Metroid purists, but it's a completely neutral aspect for flexible fans like myself. Because again, you still explore. It's just recontextualized as exploring the rooms themselves to solve progression puzzles and search for optional but extremely helpful power-ups. This isn't like Paper Mario, where the core mechanics and sense of character were torn out of the experience and replaced with entirely different ones. Metroid Prime 4 may not be built like the original on a foundational level, thanks to the removal of a fully interconnected world and the placing of macro-level thinking and routing demands on the player, but it does handle like it on a foundational level, thanks to its maintaining of the series' signature game feel and moment-to-moment exploration and combat. So they do actually share a significant amount of fundamental gameplay structure. And it seems that for me, that's really all I need. Not in like an, oh, he's willing to settle for mediocrity sort of way, but simply in a, that was always the stuff I most enjoyed, and the rest was always just sort of ancillary sort of way. Kind of weird to bring up my thesis at the halfway point of a video essay, but this is also why I titled this video Metroid Prime 4 is a litmus test. Because the fan reception to Beyond has been a fascinating litmus test of what the individual reviewer values most in a Metroid game. Metroid purists absolutely lambasted this game mercilessly. I'm talking nearly other M levels of hatred and instant rejection. But flexible fans seem to have at least embraced the aspects of it which appeal to their priorities, these micro aspects of its design. Not how much it's structured like classic Metroid, but how much it feels like classic Metroid. Now, having said all of that, let's actually talk a bit about Metroid Prime 4 itself. This is sort of going to be part mini-review and part further musings on the things I like about modern Metroid, which purists tend to reject outright, but it will contain spoilers going forward, so you have been warned. Before that, though, a quick word from today's sponsor, FiGGYZ. FiGGYZ are a brand new type of magnetic collectible figure depicting characters across a broad variety of game and anime franchises in a distinctly stylized but still appealingly uniform pixel art style. Current and upcoming waves feature franchises from other beloved Metroidvanias like Castlevania's Symphony of the Night and Dominus Collection to an assortment of Metroid-adjacent sci-fi classics like Cowboy Bebop. But many, many more are yet to come, and I can't wait for you to see some of what I've seen so far. FiGGYZ are built with premium materials, with each one having a solid weight and feel to them. Each one also comes bundled with reversible metal backgrounds for 2 display styles in one, a clean swappable display base, a wall-mounted magnet which allows them to be mounted to other surfaces with their backdrops, and the chance for a randomly inserted gold, silver, or bronze hidden chase variant. Every component, from FiGGYZ to backdrops, is modular and swappable as well. On top of all that, each FiGGYZ comes with a QR code, which allows collectors to track their growing collection on the FiGGYZ app. This app also serves as a hub for the FiGGYZverse, with even more features. And at only $14.99 SRP, FiGGYZ offer an incredible value, containing not only the figures themselves, but the reversible art backgrounds, digital tracking, and hidden chase elements all included in the package. So, if you'd like to get in on the action and help support the channel, use the promo code in the description to get 5% off all orders over $50. Once again, big thanks to FiGGYZ for partnering with the channel. Alright, so first things first. When talking about Beyond in general, I need to start by addressing the 2 big elephants in the room: the Federation companions and the psychic alien motorcycle. And just in case you didn't think this video had enough hot takes already, I actually really liked both of these things, to an extent. That said, keep in mind that I'm not only a flexible fan, but a flexible fan for whom this ever-vaunted sense of isolation was never, ever the point of Metroid. Again, to me, Metroid is Samus. Always was, always will be. But that's not to say that I don't care for atmosphere at all. It's just that I care about the Metroid universe a lot more, and I thoroughly enjoy seeing it fleshed out. Prime, in particular, has always been lauded by Metroid purists for its myriad scan logs and its general relationship to non-intrusive world building by way of these optional text dumps of lore. And while I have no problem with this, I just don't see why Prime has to be limited to exploring the aftermath of dead civilizations all the time. You see, I personally find the living components of the Metroid universe to be just as interesting as its dead ones, and I think that the latter 2 numbered Prime titles did a great job of offering balance and variety between these 2 camps. You can still uncover the tragic fates of the sentient denizens of Brio, Elysia, and of course Viewros, but you also get a window into the ongoing lives of the Federation and the Space Pirates, as well as some of the individuals who inhabit those factions. And I think that's really cool. I love that shit. Many purists seem to like throwing around this sentiment that Metroid isn't supposed to be Halo, as if Halo is supposed to have a monopoly on the concept of like actual living characters existing in a world. And even when these characters show up, it's not like they stick around for the bulk of the adventure anyway. Honestly, the somewhat lengthy prologue sequence on the GFS Olympus and Norian from Prime 3 that everyone loves complaining about so much is consistently one of my favorite parts of that game to re-experience. It was a departure from Metroid's norm, but that's what made it so cool and interesting to me. And it wasn't even a precursor of what was to come conceptually or tonally in the rest of the game. It was simply a bombastic opening sequence to establish the context of the Phazon War before the game settled into its usual Metroid Prime solitude and moodiness. And frankly, as someone who enjoys it as much as I do, I've always felt that Norian was the perfect length, so I actually felt like Beyond's prologue on Tanamar kind of blue-balled me, and I don't want any complaints about it from the purist peanut gallery. That shit was over in like 5 minutes, not including the boss fight, and I know you're not complaining about the boss fight. I will say that I preferred Corruption's decision to highlight other bounty hunters more on par with Samus's power level over Beyond's fixation on generic Federation troopers, but I appreciated having other living characters around to interact with once in a while. And it is once in a while, my god! Absolutely none of them are with you for the entirety of the area you meet them in. You meet Miles about 2/3 of the way through Fury Green, Duke and Armstrong halfway through Lava Pool. You meet Tokabi at the start of Icebelt, but he can't do anything until you're about to leave because of his gimp leg, and the android doesn't even show up until the game's final hours. Miles can't even contact you inside the major areas. I don't know what game all these people who say he won't shut up are even playing, but it's not this one. Honestly, I thought the isolation to company ratio was really good. Yes, you spend most of the Great Minds with companions, but that's by far the shortest and most linear gauntlet in the game, and is obviously meant to serve as a climactic environment to cohesively bring the team together for one last hurrah in the spotlight before the finale. In other words, it's a set piece. This aspect of the game is just flat out enjoyable to me in the ratios it exists in. Even the complaints about escorting the companions are massively overblown, in my opinion. Do you have any idea how easy it is to keep these fuckers alive? They really don't go down that frequently, and even when they do, reviving them takes like 2 seconds and costs you nothing. No resources. I didn't get a single partner death initiated game over in my entire blind playthrough, and this isn't one of those channels whose brand is like a fucking skill ceiling demonstration. I'm just an average, normal-ass, normal mode-ass, non-completionist, suboptimal type of player. If I can deal with this mechanic with literally zero stress whatsoever, then I know the sweaty tryhards should have no issue with it. If you're seriously getting game overs because you're not able to revive fallen comrades in time, then here's a little pro tip. Maybe try this extremely advanced strategy called standing near them! Something else I liked about Prime 4 was its handling of Samus's powers, at least on the face of it. While the psychic gimmick felt like a weird way to dress it up to me, I thought this fundamental concept of adding new functionality to old classics was absolutely perfect. In some ways, I actually preferred it to Mercury Steam's edition of Aeon abilities. Metroid is kind of a weird case where, for the most part, you obtain the same exact upgrades in every game over and over and over, but it still weirdly works for me for some reason. Like, Link in The Legend of Zelda usually has a nice mix of classic and new progression items from game to game, but Samus is usually pulling from the same pool, with almost no new additions. The Prime subseries is famous at this point for daring to feature new one-off suits and beam types never seen in the mainline 2D games, which recycle their progression items even more religiously, but even it often falls victim to this particular idiosyncrasy of the franchise. But I felt like Beyond's handling of Samus's abilities struck a really nice middle ground between old and new, at least in concept. Since much of the added functionality is simply a matter of context-specific environmental interactions, I do think there's room for improvement here, but I would love to see another stab at this concept in future entries. I think it's the right direction for an evolution of Samus's classic abilities to go in. But now let's use the second elephant in the room, Viola, as a transition into the aspects of Prime 4 that even I wasn't nuts about, although even this may surprise you. First of all, I have absolutely no issue with the Viola bike itself. I like the way it handles, and I'm even less allergic to Sol Valley than most other players seem to be. A word on Viola to start with, and I can already tell the kind of backlash that this is going to get, but hear me out. Game design discourse on YouTube has evolved significantly since the early days of the platform, and I believe that this has been 99% a good thing. However, I feel like once in a blue moon, everyone's head gets shoved so far up their own ass that it's like they lose the ability to appreciate the simpler things in life. So can we all slow down for a moment and just take a second to appreciate how fucking cool this imagery is? Samus's new fit looking slick as fuck as she rides around on this badass fucking alien motorcycle doing Akira power slides all over the place. Alright, I know that Sol Valley and the Viola have their issues. I'm gonna get to that. But this shit is cool as fuck on paper, and I refuse to shut up about that and not give it its fair due. I just think there should still be a place for cool factor in games, regardless of genre or franchise precedent expectations, is all I'm saying. I went into Beyond with an open mind, and the Viola didn't exactly make opening my mind a struggle. Sol Valley itself obviously wasn't nearly as well realized as it could have been, but I didn't hate everything about it, like so many people did, and when combined with the isolated main sectors, it kind of gave Prime 4 this overall feeling of almost being a sort of sci-fi Zelda game, which I was so here for. It wasn't even the first entry to do this. Prime 2 also felt distinctly Zelda-like in a number of areas, from its light and dark world motifs to its exploration of actual Zelda-style temples. On an even more foundational level, however, I've always looked at Metroid as sort of a sci-fi alternative to Zelda just as much as a Metroidvania proper. Metroidvanias and Zelda-like adventure games have shared DNA and ancestry from the very beginning. You acquire new items by exploring, and these items open up more of the map for you to explore. And again, this adds to that sense of moment-to-moment, micro-level Metroid gameplay authenticity that I think Prime 4 absolutely has in spades. Metroid Prime was never an exception to this sci-fi Zelda analogy. Beyond was just a little more on the nose about it by adding in an analog to Hyrule Field and Epona. I also didn't find the desert to be as barren and uninteresting as many people claim it to be. I mean, don't get me wrong, it does have a lot of empty space, but it's still peppered with a very decent number of points of interest. It's got Breath of the Wild-esque shrines, Federation wreckages which always contain a mech part and a power-up, and even a few basic treasure spots with a missile tank. The barrenness it did convey, I just felt added to the game's moody and, dare I say, isolating atmosphere. There's something very eerie about a vast desert on a deserted planet, and I don't think Sol Valley gets enough credit for that. No, for me, Sol Valley's only major crime is its association with green crystals, and oh boy, this is one of very few elements of Prime 4 that even I will not try to defend. I don't know what they were thinking adding a fully mandatory grinding task to a Metroid game, but since I knew going in that it would be required, I made it a point to do enough crystal grinding as I played through it, and as a result, managed to polish off my requirements simply by breaking open those boulders once I got the power bombs. If nothing else, the upgrade to the basic power beam, which was tied to the crystals, was appreciated. And while I'm still on the subject of Sol Valley, it's also extremely stupid that the upgrades to the Ice Shot are locked behind the Thunder Shot. This makes the Ice Shot the only weapon that you can't acquire a charge function for leading into the zone you'd most want to use it in. I don't know what the devs were smoking with that one, but whatever. All in all, though, my biggest gripes with Beyond probably stem more from the narrative side than anything else. Although it's not the presence of other characters that I mind, it's mostly the lore and handling of Sylux, or should I say, lack thereof. Speaking in terms of lore and world building, I'm far from the first person to bring this up, but the game has this very basic elemental aesthetic and naming structure going on. Lava Pool, Ice Belt, and Great Mines are extremely generic area names. I mean, seriously, Great Mines? Are you kidding me with that? Nothing compares to the stupidity of green energy, though. Holy shit. Was that really the best name they could come up with for what was basically the game's Phazon equivalent? Green energy? In the words of Ben Yahtzee Crushaw, we doth bestride the fields of originality like a colossus with that one, don't we, Nintendo? The elemental beams also felt like they could have used some sprucing up in the naming department. I mean, in fairness to Prime 4, the classic Ice Beam always wore its function on its sleeve, but at least the Plasma Beam tried to mask its association with heat in its name, and nothing about the Wave Beam screamed electricity to me. I give the Dark and Light Beams a pass because they were thematically appropriate one-offs, but these basic-ass Fire, Ice, and Thunder shots have no excuse. Regardless, my real issues with the story come from the narrative events themselves. First of all, the plot of Prime 4 lacks any real cohesion. The narrative opens with Sylux and the Space Pirates launching assaults on various Federation outposts, but this threat immediately vanishes from the story once the teleporter goes off. Unlocking the way home becomes the A-plot, and the tragedy of the Lamorn is organically discovered along the way, although it basically feels like the Chozo and Luminoth all over again, just with a few wrinkles. Arguably the main issue, however, is that this story lacks any sort of proper central antagonist. Now, in fairness, the Metroid Prime games didn't historically make consistent use of singular head honcho villains the way 2D Metroid often does, but they usually employ an interesting combination of unified stock enemies and a powerful rival, often but not always unaffiliated with the stock enemy. The original Prime title had both the coordinated threat of the Space Pirates and the existential threat of Phazon working in tandem, with Meta Ridley serving as a figurehead of sorts for the pirate faction, and with the titular Metroid Prime, a realization of the effects of Phazon at their most dangerous, serving as the final boss. Echoes featured both the Space Pirates and an even more dangerous hive mind in the Ing, two factions which were both evil, but also fought and at times forcibly cooperated with each other, which made Samus's mission more interesting but doubly perilous. And on top of that, Echoes also had Dark Samus, who was basically an extremely dangerous third faction all unto herself, as well as a source of continuity with the original title, since she was the result of Metroid Prime merging with the stolen Phazon suit. Phazon itself also made a significant return, establishing it as a galaxy-wide threat and not simply a one-time accident. Corruption was a little on the simpler side again, with just a single main enemy faction in the form of the ever-returning Space Pirates, although they were now being led by Dark Samus, which not only established a proper primary antagonist at the start of the game, but also served as a nice contrast from Echoes, where Dark Samus had been their enemy and given them a great deal of trouble throughout the adventure. Which leads me to a question for the developers of Prime 4. What in the world happened with Sylux? Why is he even here? After 18 years of this vague buildup, he gets almost no screen time and somehow even less closure. Despite apparently being set up as the narrative's primary overarching antagonist during the prologue, by all accounts, he essentially has nothing to do with this story, and his actions throughout the game seem random and make no sense. Firstly, I'm skipping to the secret ending for a second here, but his long-awaited backstory reveal is fucking awful. He has a vendetta against Samus and the Federation because he was a power-hungry moron who got his own platoon wiped out by the Space Pirates after he disobeyed direct orders not to engage with them. Like, just to be clear, he has no qualms with the pirates themselves, who actually built and fired the weapon that killed all his men and nearly killed him, but Samus and the Federation, who literally swooped in and saved his ass without even chastising him for disobeying orders, they're the subjects of his wrath? Even if the writers wanted him to have been an asshole all along, rather than going for a sympathetic backstory, this has to have been the worst shit they could have possibly come up with. Frankly, I think Sylux's motivation would have been better off just remaining a vague mystery, because the one they gave him is so stupid that it actively detracts from him as a character. So his backstory is absolute ass, but it doesn't stop there. All he does throughout the game is periodically harass Samus indirectly, and even his ability to do that doesn't feel earned. Like, how the fuck does he control Lamorn technology? Samus can't even scan any of their shit with her semi-magical Chizodian battlesuit until the Lamorn themselves give her the FiGGYZ. Yet somehow Sylux is able to wire himself into their whole system and gain control of damn near every machine on the planet with his far less sophisticated stolen Federation tech? And I mean, I know that his primary motivation is revenge, however obscenely misplaced it may be, but he supposedly hates the Federation first and foremost, and Samus really only by proxy. So why is he so utterly unconcerned with getting off of Viewros? If anything, he should have begrudgingly teamed up with her, not tried to kill her at the expense of getting himself home to continue harassing the Federation at large. But even regardless of context, his actions just feel so aimless and meandering. Sending drone copies of himself after her in Vault Forge, and withdrawing the bridge and firing on her from like a Lamorn combat chopper in Lava Pool didn't read as anything more than a petty nuisance when he had no overarching goals for those actions to be in service of. Dark Samus, by contrast, took some pleasure in the potential opportunity to exact revenge on Samus for nearly killing her in the first game, but even as early as Prime 2, she had bigger fish to fry. She was collecting Phazon to amass power, a goal she had already initiated pursuit of before Samus even arrived on Aether, and one she would have continued regardless. And in Prime 3, she had aspirations of galaxy-wide infection and domination. Her actions were always specific and targeted, and not even aimed at Samus herself. There was a master plan, and something with real stakes that Samus needed to avert. But Sylux is barely even in this game, and even when he does make an appearance, he isn't just lacking in an interesting overarching goal. He's essentially lacking in the basic common sense needed to preserve his own long-term well-being. And without the space pirates to back him up, the only major stock enemies we're left with, aside from the endless drones he's somehow hijacked, are the Grievers, which are both completely feral and unable to infect other life forms, meaning they too essentially just serve as a random nuisance to Samus and company, rather than an existential threat to the galaxy. Unlike the space pirates and the Ing, they could genuinely be replaced with any sort of wild animal on Viewros, and the ludonarrative elements would be functionally unaffected. They may as well just be a bunch of rabid space gorillas, aside from the tragic detail of what exactly they are, something which affects the Lamorn's backstory and absolutely nothing else. And what about those weird new fusion Metroids that Sylux somehow bioengineered? This is the first Metroid Prime game not to feature vanilla Metroids as a fightable enemy type, and the only trace of them we ever see after the prologue are the boss enemies they've conveniently fused with on Viewros. And we never even get to see the actual fusion occur after Aberax. In a game that desperately needed greater enemy variety, why didn't we get to fight any Metroids directly, or see them fuse with some of the more generic enemy types like the Grievers? One of the advantages to all of Prime being set before Metroid 2 is that the games can feature Metroids as much as they want without needing to invent or recycle excuses for their continued existence. But Prime 4 frankly seems to forget they ever existed at all most of the time. The lack of enemy variety in general was just incredibly disappointing. Like, seriously, Retro, why would you go to all of the trouble of modeling, animating, and programming the space pirates, only to keep them exclusive to a 5-minute prologue in a game this lacking in enemy variety? You couldn't have contrived for some space pirates to be teleported to Viewros also? Really? And my final disappointment was, probably not surprisingly, with the ending itself. The most generous thing I can say about it is that it appears to be setting up for a sequel, which I would have wanted regardless, just because Metroid Prime is absolute comfort food for me. But I think ending on such a blatant and unsatisfying cliffhanger was in incredibly poor taste, and possibly catastrophic taste if a sequel never actually gets greenlit. Again, the original Prime trilogy was a trilogy and had continuity and cohesion, but the individual adventures ended on a genuinely satisfying note. Talon 4 was purged of its Phazon corruption in 1, and the surviving Luminoth were saved from the Ing threat in Echoes. They didn't withhold triumphant victories from Samus just because FiGGYZ was still out there somewhere, or because Dark Samus appeared in a post-credit scene. But Beyond's ending, good God! Samus is forced to leave Sylux and her companions stranded on Viewros, and worst of all, actually seems resigned to this outcome based on her relinquishing of Tokabi's charm. I guess the successful exporting and planting of the memory fruit is supposed to serve as her victory, and the funny thing is that if the Federation troopers hadn't been in this story, it would have. But again, I personally am more fond of the living characters in the world of Metroid than the dead ones. So, while the Lamorn were about as interesting as the Chozo and the Luminoth, I'm honestly more invested in getting these living characters home than I am in transporting the fucking memory fruit. And yet, ironically, despite what I just said, I don't even like the human cast of Beyond enough to want to see them again in a sequel. Not because I resent them for breaking my immersion by existing, but because they're just kind of a bland bunch of coconuts anyway. So the only good send-off for them, for me, personally, would have been to just rescue them in this title, and then functionally forget them going forward. The way this ending played out, though, now we're either going to have to rescue them in Prime 5, possibly at the expense of being introduced to new, more interesting characters, or we're really not ever going to see them again, and much like Samus, have to just live with the knowledge that we fully failed to save them. Yeesh, at least they have each other, I guess. But it really is the worst of both worlds. And if this is how Sylux's story ends, talk about an anticlimax. Still, as amazingly disappointed as I was with the story, I did very much enjoy my time with the game itself, so I'd like to end this discussion on a more positive note. While I can already unequivocally say that Metroid Prime 4 is my least favorite of the numbered entries, that margin isn't nearly as wide for me as it is for many others. It's still a strong video game when looked at in a vacuum, and has plenty of strengths and fun new ideas, even when compared to its sister games. The art direction and soundtrack are incredible, even by series standards. So, if nothing else, the visuals and music at least very much surpass Dread, even if not the overall quality of the product. I actually enjoyed the Viola for what it was, even if I wish there were more interesting things to do with it. And the Viola suit is my favorite Prime original suit since the Dark suit in Echoes. Honestly, one of my favorite things about driving on the Viola was simply that it actually shifted the action to third person enough for me to enjoy looking at the damn suit from time to time. I personally lament the fact that the Prime games are in first person when Samus looks this damn slick, like god damn, but that's a rant for another day. All in all, I very much enjoyed my time with Beyond for what it was, and like all of its predecessors, I will absolutely be replaying it from time to time. I really hope that it gets a follow-up in the future, one which can improve upon the base scene here, since there's plenty of room for improvement. But aside from farming the fucking green energy crystals, I never found myself getting bored with it. I was engaged from start to finish, engrossed in the atmosphere, being Samus and doing Samus things as I explored the world, enjoying the atmospheric and gameplay variety brought on by the very occasional stints of companionship, and yes, even zooming along the desert sands to one of the raddest visuals this franchise has ever produced. I hope time will prove kinder to Prime 4 than it did to Other M, but regardless, I will be continuing to enjoy it, Metroid-shaped warts and all, for years to come. Thanks for watching. And if you like what you saw here and you'd like to help support the channel, then please remember to do those algorithm things. Like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me how you feel about Metroid Prime 4, as well as the Metroid franchise at large. Was Beyond everything you hoped it would be? A colossal disappointment? Or something in between? The channel's getting pretty close to 10,000 subs, and I'd love to see if we can't push it over the line in the near future. So let's really get a conversation going here. And once again, big thanks to FiGGYZ for partnering with the channel. If you'd like to get your own hands on some of your own delightfully 8-bit coded video game swag, then remember to check the description for a link and discount code to get 5% off all orders over $50. Regardless, thanks for stopping by, and here's hoping the galaxy will remain at peace until next mission.